We are back again with On the Money Line, a podcast by MMAPlay365. I'm your host Newsome, and we're here again at the Apex in Vegas for UFC Vegas 21. This event is headlined with Leon Edwards versus Belal Muhammad. It's been a crazy ride for Belal, and not only does he get a main event slot here, but he also gets a massive step up in competition and a huge opportunity to climb the UFC welterweight rankings as well. I'm really happy for Belal. He seems like a really good dude, and he's a fighter that puts in the hard work too. So he really does deserve this opportunity. It's sad though how it came about, as Leon Edwards versus Khamzat Chimaev had to be cancelled for the third time, and Khamzat is in a really bad way too, suffering extreme symptoms from COVID-19 to the point where he may or may not have retired from MMA. I honestly hope he does make a full and healthy recovery and that we get to see him back where he belongs, inside the octagon. But just before we get into the breakdowns, as always, there's a few things to mention in regards to MMAPlay365. Last weekend was a decent night overall for us. We did drop the dog of the week, which was Joe Benavidez. Joe B was also an official bet too, but our two other official bets were both underdogs as well, and they both cashed, with Kyler Phillips looking phenomenal and Aljamain Sterling gifting us a little bit of luck there. But a cash ticket is a cash ticket, and along with that, 7 out of our 12 fun parlay options won, and one of the pre-made parlay options won as well. So all in all, I can't complain. Remember, we have multiple packages on the MMAPlay365 website for all the UFC betting advice you'll ever need. We also have various subscription lengths and options too, so to see our full service list, please go and visit MMAPlay365.com for more information or to sign up today. And let's break down some fights. In the main event, we've got Leon Edwards versus Belal Muhammad. Edwards is currently the -260 favourite. The comeback on Muhammad at +220 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I do understand why Leon Edwards is a -260 favourite. He's on an 8-fight win streak. He's fought some of the best competition in the UFC. He's looked relatively solid throughout all those fights as well, so I do understand it. However, Belal is a really good fighter, and he has the ability to make fights close, even if from a skill set or a stylistic perspective he's not well matched in that fight. He has the ability to make fights close. So for that reason, I feel that the -260 betting line on Leon Edwards, I just don't see too much value in that money line, because I do have a feeling that Belal could make this fight play out a lot closer than what the betting line suggests. So -260, I do understand it, but I don't think there's too much value in the betting line either. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, I do think we're going to see more money coming in on Leon Edwards. I can understand that side of it, the fact that he is ranked much higher than Belal. Belal's taken this fight on short notice. Leon Edwards has had and fought against the better level of competition, so I do think money will come in on Leon Edwards. I think it might get to the -280, -290, maybe even -300, but I think at some point we are going to see some dog money coming in on Belal Muhammad, because if Leon Edwards does hit -300, then the value is going to be on the underdog in this fight. So yeah, I can see more money coming in on Edwards, but that brick wall will be hit at around -300 in my opinion. As for how this fight plays out though, as I've already mentioned, this is actually a good fight, and it could be one that plays out really close. And you look at the skill set and the style of both fighters, both Edwards and Belal have got really similar styles. They're not absolutely outstanding in any one particular area in mixed martial arts, but they're so well rounded at a very high level as well. So from a striking perspective, they can both hang with the best strikers in the division. From a wrestling perspective, they've both got wrestling. From a grappling perspective, they can both grapple defensively and offensively as well. So it's a really good fight, and it's one of those fights where I think it could play out quite close. But the reason why I think Leon Edwards is the rightful favourite in this fight is, like I've said, not only the level of competition of who he's fought, but I do think that he is just slightly better in every single area of mixed martial arts. And normally in these types of fights where both fighters are very similar in styles, the fighter that does tend to edge out all those different areas in MMA, that normally leads to the betting line being quite wide, because you've got to think, well, where does Belal beat Leon Edwards? And it is a really difficult question, because if this fight plays out on the feet, I think it's going to be close. But I think Leon Edwards, in regards to his distance management, his selection of strikes, how he gauges the range, his ability to slide in and out of the pocket, ultimately remaining quite safe, doesn't get countered too much. I just think that Leon Edwards is just that little bit better than Belal Muhammad on the feet, enough for him to outpoint him, and if this fight goes to a decision, then get up on the numbers in volume and look better in the judges' eyes. If this turns into a wrestling battle, I think it's going to be very difficult for Belal Muhammad to take Leon Edwards down. I don't think it's impossible for him to take Edwards down. I think it could definitely be possible, but in those clinch grappling scenarios, Leon Edwards is a little bit taller. I think he's going to be a little bit stronger, a little bit more physical, and I think that if Edwards is in a bad position in the clinch, he's going to be able to reverse the position, put himself in an advantageous position, and at that point, whilst the distance has been closed, whilst they're clinched up, I think he'd probably look for takedowns himself and try and get some top control. And that's the other part of this fight, you know, in the grappling realm. If Belal does take Leon down, I don't think he'll be able to keep him down for very long. I think Leon will be able to get back up to his feet. His jiu-jitsu is good. But if Leon takes Belal Muhammad down, I don't think Belal will stay on his back for too long, but I do think that Leon will be able to establish a position topside and be able to, you know, run that clock down a little bit, score points whilst doing so, and ultimately win rounds that way and potentially the fight. So I do think it's going to be difficult for Belal. If you're asking me for a path to victory here, what I would be saying is potentially a similar game plan to the one that Belal employed against Diego Lima. Chop at the legs early, really start to hurt the leg of Leon, and at that point he'll start to have more success in the striking, he'll have more success in the clinch, the takedowns might be there if he wants them as well, all because of that leg that could potentially be hurt of Leon Edwards. But I think it's easier said than done. I think it's going to be a difficult spot for Belal to win. Some of the rounds might be close, but I just feel that if this fight does go to a decision, then I think it's going to be Leon Edwards that has racked up the volume. I think it's Edwards that's going to have had the forward pressure, the forward movement. I think Edwards is going to be the one who's more likely to score takedowns, who's more likely to establish more topside control throughout the fight as well. Both cardios check out, both are really durable, both are going to be really hard to finish. So I think Edwards is just going to do the better body of work over 5 rounds, and for that reason I'm picking Leon Edwards to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Misha Cirkunov versus Ryan Spann. Cirkunov is currently the -120 favourite. The comeback on Spann at +100 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I do think the value sits with Cirkunov at -120. He actually opened at -150, which I believe is much closer to where the betting line should be right now. So the fact that he's now sitting at -120, I do think that Cirkunov is the value side. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, as I've said, Cirkunov opened at -150. All that money has come in on Ryan Spann, push Cirkunov back down to -120. It's very close to a pick'em. I do think that we are going to see some fluctuation from this point onwards though. And the reason I say that is I'd be very surprised to see this fight enter a pick'em, or I'd be even more surprised to see Cirkunov at plus money, which are the next steps if more money keeps coming in on Spann. If Spann comes to -105, -110, then I just think that that's then gone too far. So I do think at this point we will see more money coming in on Cirkunov. That'll push him back up to maybe -130, -135. And then there might be some more money coming back in on Spann. But ultimately, when these two step in the cage on Saturday night, I would expect to see Cirkunov at around -125, -130. And as for how this fight plays out, it's a really interesting fight because I feel that Cirkunov is just better in every aspect of mixed martial arts. But the one trump card that Ryan Spann has is his size. He's a big light heavyweight, 6'5". He's very physical. He's got power in his hands when he lets them fly. When he can get on top of his opponent, he's quite heavy as well. And he's also got really good chokes. He's got a really tight squeeze. So from a physical perspective, Ryan Spann is going to pose problems. But when I'm looking at everything from a technical perspective, Cirkunov just checks so many boxes here. In the striking, I think Cirkunov's more active. I think that he throws with power as well. He fights out of a southpaw stance. He loves to bomb that big left hand on his opponents. Ryan Spann doesn't have too much movement inside the cage. His head's on the centre line quite a lot, so I could see Spann getting hit with that big bomb numerous times. It might not even take numerous times. It might only take one to knock him out. So with Spann, I do worry about his movement. I do worry about the head being on the centre line. That makes him extremely hittable. He doesn't produce too much volume inside the cage either, and the longer the fight goes on, the more I feel that he just becomes less active. You look at the Sam Alvey fight. That Sam Alvey fight shouldn't have been that close in my opinion. Spann started off really well, but Alvey built himself into the fight. He was landing some good shots, and Alvey almost stole a decision from him. That should have been a fight, in my opinion, that Spann just absolutely looked great in, and he didn't. Then you look at the Johnny Walker fight. Spann started well, but then he dropped off, and Walker ended up finding a finish on him with Spann shooting for takedowns. And that's the other thing, when you come into the wrestling and grappling side of things with Misha Cirkunov, he's just really advanced in these areas. His wrestling's good, he's got a good blast double leg. When he gets on top of his opponents, or even if he's on bottom, he's a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and he's a good black belt as well. You look at what he did to Jimmy Crute in regards to being able to reverse a really bad position that he was put in, and able to get Crute in a choke, in a Japanese necktie, and submit Crute. That's something that I'm telling you, not many fighters will be able to achieve that against Jimmy Crute. He's a solid fighter, really good grappler himself, a really high level black belt himself as well. So the fact that Cirkunov did that to Crute, I definitely think he'll be able to look great against Spann on the mat in the grappling department, and I think he'll be able to get takedowns on Spann as well. He does have to be careful of leaving his head on the outside and Spann locking up a guillotine. Like I say, Spann's got a really good tight squeeze on his choke, so Cirkunov has to be careful there. The only other aspect I could see Spann really taking advantage of Cirkunov is if Spann can cause a scramble mid-takedown, get on top of Cirkunov, maybe take Cirkunov's back or make Cirkunov turn away from him. Because the one worry here for Cirkunov is the fact that we have seen in multiple fights when an opponent takes his back and flattens him out, Cirkunov really does just shut down. It looks like he gives up a little bit. He starts eating shots once he's flattened out, or he's susceptible to a rear naked choke as well. But either way, it's a really dangerous thing for Cirkunov to do, to shut himself down and, you know, like I've already mentioned, look like you've given up when an opponent has such a dominant position on you. So if Spann can get that dominant position on top of Cirkunov, he could absolutely stop Cirkunov in this spot. But like I say, outside of that, I think that Cirkunov's the better striker, I think he's the better wrestler, and I think he's the better grappler, especially topside as well. And I do think that Cirkunov's fought the much better level of competition as well. Sure, he's lost against some of those high-level guys, but the fact that he has that experience does go a long way in MMA. So I think Cirkunov's in a good spot here. I think he's the more likely fighter to win a decision. I think he's the more likely fighter to find a finish, although I wouldn't be totally shocked if Spann found a finish at the same time. You know, if Spann got on top of him and knocked him out, the referee pulls Spann off, I'll not be shocked. But I think from a striking and grappling perspective that Cirkunov is more likely to finish in this fight. I think he's got more paths to victory, and for those reasons I'm picking Misha Cirkunov to win this fight. And in the next fight, we're in the heavyweight division. We've got Ben Rothwell versus Phillipe Lins. And on the betting line, we've got a -110 pick'em on either side. As for where the value is on the betting line, I think if you've got a solid read on this fight, then at -110 on either side, it's definitely playable. As I've said, as long as you've got that strong read. And as for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, I think we're going to see a lot of fluctuation here. We've already seen fluctuation. You know, Rothwell opened -105. He then went as wide as -135. And now it appears that they've settled at a pick'em. So I could see some money coming in either side here. I could see that flip-flopping throughout fight week, but ultimately when they both step into the cage on Saturday night, I still think the betting lines are going to be close, and it wouldn't shock me for it still to be a -110 pick'em. And as for how this fight plays out, I honestly think that both fighters really need to win here. Rothwell is coming off one loss against Tabora. He did beat Struve and OSP in the two fights prior to that, but he wasn't looking great in either fight, if I'm being honest. And before the Struve fight, it was on a 3-fight losing streak to JDS, Blagoy Ivanov and Andrei Arlovsky. So in my opinion, for Rothwell to raise his stock in this fight, he's got to put on a really good performance. And on the other side, you've got Phillipe Lins, who came into the UFC with some hype behind him, obviously coming off some really good performances in the PFL, and he just hasn't looked that great himself in the UFC, if I'm being honest. You know, his debut against Arlovsky, sure, Arlovsky has that weird ability to make any fight close, but then he goes in there against Tanner Boser and gets knocked out in round 1. So again, for Lins, 0-2 in the UFC, he needs to really make a statement here if he wants to remain in the UFC. I'm not saying he's going to get his walking papers if he loses, loses, but he's definitely not going to be in a position to argue and make a case for him to remain in the UFC if he loses this fight and goes 0-3. So I do believe there's a lot on the line for these fighters in this fight. I do think that the fight could be quite close as well, but I am edging towards Phillipe Lins, and the reason for that is I feel like it's going to be a low volume affair, and Rothwell's movement I feel is going to aid the game of Phillipe Lins as well. So Rothwell doesn't move erratically, he's quite slow, plodding, comes forward, looks to sit down on his shots and really hurt his opponents, doesn't output a ton of volume, gets hit more than he lands on his opponent, and the same can be said for Phillipe Lins there as well. But I think the movement of Rothwell is going to allow Lins to feel his way into this fight. I think it's going to allow Lins to get his low kicks going, which is definitely a weapon of his, but against an opponent that really doesn't move too much and isn't that active like Rothwell, I do think it's going to give Lins opportunities at range just to slide in, kick the leg of Rothwell, slide back out if he needs to, and then once that leg starts getting hurt of Rothwell, then Lins can start putting together some combinations. But the one worry that I've got from Phillipe Lins' perspective is that chin, because that was a nasty knockout against Tanabosa, and Rothwell hits really hard as well, so it wouldn't shock me if Lins stepped in to engage inside boxing range and Rothwell just landed something hard on him and knocked him out. That's definitely a potential outcome in this fight, but if that knockout punch from Rothwell doesn't land, I do have to consider how this fight is going to play out. I'd be surprised to see Lins knock Rothwell out. Obviously it's not impossible, these are heavyweights with 4-ounce gloves, so I do believe that any man could knock any other man out in this division at 265 pounds, but I do feel that Lins doesn't sit down as much on his punches. He'd be more inclined to go for a volume-based performance. So if Rothwell doesn't knock Lins out, then I could see the fight potentially going 3 rounds, going the distance. And I just think Lins is going to land more on Rothwell throughout 15 minutes. I think his volume is going to be a little better. And I do think that the body of work that Lins puts into this fight will help him over a 3-round decision as well. So for me, if Rothwell doesn't knock Lins out, he's putting himself at serious risk of losing this fight. Lins could knock him out, but if he doesn't, then I do think that Lins will look better in the judges' eyes. So for those reasons, I'm picking Phillipe Lins to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got a really good fight here, and probably the best fight on the card in my opinion. We've got Dan Ige versus Gavin Tucker. Ige is currently the -125 favourite to come back on Tucker at +105 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I do think it sits with Dan Ige. I did expect the betting line to be a little bit wider, but part of me does understand why there has been some love on Gavin Tucker for sure. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, I think it's going to fluctuate. You know, Dan Ige's been up at -135, -140. Then you get all that love coming back in on Gavin Tucker, closing the line up to roughly where it is right about now. I do feel that this might be the barrier though for Dan Ige. I don't think it'll get much lower. If it got down to a -110 pick'em, I would be very surprised. So I do think we'll see more money coming in on Dan Ige, pushing him up to that -140, -145 line, and then from there we'll see a surge of Gavin Tucker bets coming back in. So I do think that the current betting line is where both fighters are going to be when they step into the cage on Saturday night. But as for how this fight plays out, I think it's going to be quite an explosive fight. I think both fighters are going to come aggressive. Both fighters will look to land hard strikes. I think both fighters will use combinations. I think both fighters will use the striking to set up the wrestling as well, so they can get to work with the grappling. I think that we're going to see a real true mixed martial arts fight in this spot, and the fight makes perfect sense because you've got Dan Ige, who in my opinion might have hit his ceiling fighting Calvin Kattar. Obviously the win before that was Edson Barboza, so those are two serious fighters in the division. Then you've got Gavin Tucker, who's come back off that long layoff after the bad beating against Rick Glenn, and he's actually managed to put 3 wins together, which he's looked really good in those 3 wins as well. So it is a great fight and it does make sense. The thing here for me though is I feel there's a big difference between fighting Calvin Kattar and Edson Barboza to fighting Sung Woo Choi, Justin James and Billy Quarantillo. I don't mean any disrespect when I say that, it's just there's levels in this game, and I feel that the opponents that Dan Ige's fought recently are just absolutely on a different level to the opponents that Gavin Tucker's been beating. And yes, Ige lost against Calvin Kattar, most fighters will in the division, but he actually beat Edson Barboza. It was a controversial decision. I do see the angle on Barboza. I also see the angle on Ige after rewatching the fight as well, but the bottom line is the competition that Ige's been fighting is just levels above the competition that Tucker's been fighting, and I do think that Ige is the better fighter in this spot. The one thing that was made really apparent to me whilst watching tape here is the difference in speed in this fight. Now, Danny Ige's striking has come on a long way, and let's not forget, this guy's base in MMA is grappling, it's Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It reminds me a lot of guys like Vicente Luque and Tom Aspinall that also came into the UFC with that base and have just improved on the striking so much that now that's the predominant style. So Ige's striking's come on, but the one thing that Ige has is brutal speed, and I think that although Tucker starts really fast and he's really sharp and crisp as well in regards to his boxing inside boxing range, the longer the fight goes on, the more that speed diminishes a little bit of Tucker, and Tucker's punches come a little bit laboured. He also spends too much time inside of that boxing range the longer the fight goes on before being able to exit out, and it's those scenarios where I feel that Ige's just going to absolutely blast Gavin Tucker with combinations with his hands. For me, Tucker, to win this fight, he's got to get his wrestling going. He's got to be able to take Ige down, get some control time, and just ultimately just waste some minutes on the clock, do good work on the mat and win rounds that way. But like I've already mentioned, Ige's base is jiu-jitsu. He's a very good grappler, whether he's topside or whether he's on his back. I do think that Tucker can have some success on top though. I just don't know if he's going to be able to have enough success for the longer the fight goes on to be able to steal 2 out of the 3 rounds. I think the better work in this fight is going to be done on the feet. I feel the fight's going to be won and lost on the feet. And although Tucker's not outmatched on the feet against Ige, I just feel like he's going to be a little step behind for as long as this fight goes on. I feel that Ige is going to be able to get his jab going. Behind the jab, he sets up nice combinations. He uses low kicks as well. And this is a guy that withstood the damage that Edson Barboza was delivering to his legs in regards to the kicks and the kicks to the body as well. So Ige's durable. In that fight against Calvin Kattar, Ige wasn't totally outmatched there either. Sure, he lost 50-45, but the rounds were close. It's just Kattar edged it, and I think there's a big difference again between Kattar and Tucker. So for me, it could be a close fight if Tucker really gets his wrestling going and is able to establish good positions topside and, like I say, run the clock down, spend time on top and win rounds that way. But I do think that the bigger moments in this fight is going to come in the striking, it is going to come in the stand-up, and I do think that the fight, because of that, is going to be won and lost on the feet. I think Ige is going to provide more volume. I think he's going to hit a little bit harder. I definitely think he's going to be the quicker striker as well. So for those reasons, I'm picking Dan Ige to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got a fight that should have happened a couple of weeks ago. It's been rebooked. We've got Angela Hill versus Ashley Yoder. Hill is currently the minus 380 favourite. The comeback on Yoder at plus 315 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, I completely understand that Angela Hill's a minus 380 favourite here. I do though think that the line is too wide to be playing in this sort of spot, so the money line for me holds no value, but like I say, I understand why Angela Hill is this big of a favourite. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, I think Angela Hill's going to be in all those parlays. I think the minus 380 will turn to minus 400, minus 420, maybe even minus 450. I do think that Hill's going to be a popular bet, and like I always say, those parlay entries do impact the betting line, so I do think Angela Hill's line gets wider. I think she'll step into the cage roughly around minus 420. As for how this fight plays out though, I've already broken this fight down once, but I'll do it again. I think Angela Hill is just better everywhere here, maybe apart from the wrestling, but she's not very easy to take down. So I do think that Hill's defensive wrestling is better than the offensive wrestling of Ashley Yoder. So Ashley Yoder's path to victory, in my opinion, is to take Angela Hill down, try and get some top time, run the clock down, try and win rounds that way, or try and find a submission. But that path to victory is pretty much nullified in my opinion, because like I say, Hill's not easy to take down, and I don't think Yoder's going to have a very easy time even closing the distance, never mind trying to take her down. So I think it's a really difficult fight for Ashley Yoder. Angela Hill on the feet, in regards to the striking, is levels above Yoder. She's going to land volume. She's going to be difficult to hit. She's going to be difficult to make reads on. I think Yoder's going to get frustrated with the movement. I think Hill's going to crack her with nice long shots in regards to the punches. I think she's going to kick her from the outside. I think she'll get in close in the clinch and use knees and elbows. I think Hill's going to have a really good time of it on the feet. It's It's just she's got to be careful that she doesn't overexert herself, she doesn't make any silly mistakes, because if Hill does start getting taken down, then the fight is going to get very sketchy for her and it's going to be much closer than the lines suggest. But I think Yoder would need multiple takedowns in multiple rounds to be able to win this fight, and I just don't see it happening. I think Hill's going to land a ton of volume. I think she's the more likely fighter to find a finish. I think she's the more likely fighter to win a decision. So for those reasons, I'm picking Angela Hill to win this fight. And in the next fight, we finally get to see the return of Matheus Nicolau versus Manel Kape. Now, Manel Kape's taken this fight on short notice. Nicolau should have been fighting Tagir Ulanbekov, but Ulanbekov has pulled out for the second time. So, in my opinion, this is actually a much better fight now Manel Kape stepped in. And even on short notice, it's Kape who is the favourite at -145 with the comeback on Nicolau at +125 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, I do think the value sits with the underdog in Nicolau. I think at +125 there's value on it. It probably should be around a pick'em, which is where it opened, so I do agree with where the line opened, but at +125 that's where I see the value side. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, I think the +125 is going to grow. I think people are really high on Manel Kape. He was preparing for his UFC debut as a backup fighter for the UFC Flyweight Championship, and then in his actual debut, he fought Alejandro Pantoja, who is a phenomenal fighter and a fighter that's been at the top of the flyweight division for years. So people are high on Kape. Like I said, the betting line's opened at a -110 pick'em. All that money's coming on Kape, so that's what people think of him. I think Kape will rise to around -160, maybe even -165. But I think at that point it might stop, so it wouldn't shock me to see Kape coming into the cage on Saturday night at around -160. As for how this fight plays out though, it's a really interesting fight because when you look back outside of the UFC and Manel Kape's previous fights, one of the holes that has been made apparent is his defensive grappling. When he's on his back, he can struggle. He can get back up to his feet once or twice, but if he continuously gets taken down, every single takedown, he seems to lose a bit of that morale each time, and ultimately it gets harder for him to stand back up each time he's taken down. And then with Nicolau, he's a legit Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt with good grappling, good solid heavy topside grappling, good submissions. He's a real nightmare to deal with if he can get you down, and he also makes it really difficult for you to stand back up to your feet as well. So Nicolau has got real strengths in the areas where I think Manel Kape's weakest, but Manel Kape has got good offensive wrestling and good offensive grappling. It's just when he gets put on his back. So I think it's going to be a really interesting fight in regards to that wrestling and grappling aspect. Now on the feet, Nicolau's not just a grappler, he's a really good boxer as well. He's sharp, he's clean, he's crisp, he's got good fundamentals, and he's got power in his hands. He's also got a solid low kick that he really keeps to throughout the fight and for however long the fight goes on as well, which is always good to see. But I do think that Kape is going to have advantages in this fight on the feet, striking, as long as he kicks out volume. Against Pantoja, he was very reserved. He didn't really want to kick on. He didn't really want to push forward and be aggressive and land a ton of volume, and I've got no idea why. Potential UFC debut jitters, but if he does that against Nicolau, I think that Kape's going to get beaten in this fight because Nicolau will be active on the feet. He will land more volume. He does have an advantage in regards to the wrestling and the grappling. So for me, if Kape doesn't get this volume game going on the feet, he's going to lose this fight. So it's important that he does. I do think that he will pour more volume into this fight. I do think on the feet, Nicolau is going to run the risk of being knocked out by engaging. And I don't think that Nicolau's got durability issues. It's just when Kape really gets it going and starts landing hard shots, he's going to be able to knock a lot of fighters out in this division. So Nicolau's got to mix things up inside the cage. And luckily for Nicolau, that's his game. Obviously, all fights start standing, so he'll start getting his boxing going, his clean, crisp striking. He'll start firing out his low kick as well, whilst making reads in regards to entering the pocket, looking for a takedown. And the takedowns will come. He will shoot takedowns. Even if he's not successful in this fight with getting Kape down, it's just going to give Kape that pause. And Nicolau has that similar style to Pantoja, where Kape might be a little bit apprehensive going to the mat with Nicolau because of his jiu-jitsu credentials. So it could end up playing out very similar to what the Pantoja fight did. And I don't think Nicolau is a mile behind Pantoja in regards to his skill set in MMA. He's just got to be really careful that he doesn't enter too many brawls with Kape and he doesn't get hit too often by the big punches of Kape, because if he does, he's probably going to get knocked out. However, if he doesn't get knocked out, I think the striking's going to be quite close. I think it's going to be a very close fight on the feet, but I like Nicolau to score takedowns here. If he does take Kape down, I definitely think that he can spend time on top of Kape. So when I'm looking at the different ways for Nicolau to win this fight, I feel that he could win a striking battle. It would be very close though. But then if he starts mixing things up in regards to the wrestling and the grappling, I think that alleviates some of the close factor and Nicolau might start pulling away with the fight. And then if he goes for a relentless wrestling and grappling game plan, then he could absolutely win there as well. Listen, Kape's a good striker. He could be Nicolau on the feet as well. He could absolutely knock Nicolau out also. I wouldn't be shocked at either of those outcomes, but I just think that Nicolau is the more well-rounded fighter, and because of that he should be able to employ multiple game plans which will give him multiple paths to victory, and it's for that reason I'm picking Matheus Nicolau to win this fight. And in the next fight we've got Eryk Anders versus Darren Stewart. Darren Stewart is the current -185 favourite. The comeback on Anders at +160 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I do think that the line is quite fair, but if you are pushing me for a value side, I would say the value side is on Darren Stewart at -185. If this turns into -200, -210, or maybe even wider, then the value would flip onto Eryk Anders in my opinion. As for where the betting line moves, I do think that we might see it go to -190, -195, but naturally I do think we'll see money coming back in on Eryk Anders, because I do feel that people will see this as a close fight and it could go to a decision and it might be a split decision, and in those situations it's always better to have the money on the plus money underdog than the juiced favourite. Ultimately though, when both fighters step into the cage on Saturday night, I don't think the betting lines are going to be too far off from where they're sitting right about now. As for how this fight plays out though, I actually think this is going to be a really difficult fight for Eryk Anders. I'm not saying he's going to get whitewashed, I'm not saying he's going to get dominated for 3 rounds, but I just think that he's going to have trouble in this fight, especially late on in fights. Now, one thing we used to say about Darren Stewart is that his best round is normally his first round, and after then he starts fading, but that's just not the case anymore. Darren Stewart has really improved his cardio and he's got a good 3-round gas tank in him, and I think that's going to be one of the main advantages for him in this fight, because although I don't think that Anders has got gas tank problems, I definitely think that he's a fighter that does slow down the longer the fight goes on, and if Darren Stewart can really start this fight at a really high pace, really put the pressure on Anders, hit him with a lot of volume, be really active, then that's going to help him the longer the fight goes on, because Eryk Anders will slow down more the longer the fight goes on in those sort of situations when the fights start really fast. In regards to how they match up, striking, wrestling, grappling, I think Darren Stewart has got advantages pretty much everywhere apart from the offensive wrestling, and it's actually similar to what I was saying earlier with Angela Hill and Ashley Yoder, because I also think in this fight that Darren Stewart's defensive wrestling is probably better than the offensive wrestling of Eryk Anders. So Eryk Anders' path to victory in regards to scoring takedowns and landing ground and pound might be a little bit nullified here. I do think if he sticks to it and becomes relentless, he will be able to get Stewart down, but Stewart's got a knack of being able to stand back up to his feet. On the feet, striking, I think Stewart's quicker, I think he hits harder, I think he packs more volume, I think he mixes things up better as well in regards to using kicks as well as his punches, whereas Eryk Anders is quite boxing heavy, and although he hits hard, I don't think that his speed matches up well with the speed of Darren Stewart. So I think Stewart's got a lot of advantages in this fight. For a start, I think that he can keep this fight vertical. Maybe later in the fight he goes for his own takedowns and lands ground and pound like he did against Kevin Holland. But I also think when they're exchanging on the feet that Stewart's going to be quicker to the punch. I think he's going to land more combinations, he's going to land more volume, and just overall get the better of the exchanges. So I think it's a good fight for Darren Stewart. I think he can win this fight in multiple ways in regards to striking and then wrestling later on in the fight if Anders is tired. So for those reasons, I'm picking Darren Stewart to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Cortney Casey versus JJ Aldrich. Aldrich is currently the -150 favourite. The comeback on Casey at +130 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I do think it could potentially be a close fight. I do think that there are advantages for Cortney Casey in this fight. So +130, I think the line's too wide. I'm going to side with the underdog and say that Cortney Casey is the value side in this spot. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, I do think that Aldrich has had some love. She's now sitting at -150. The lines were much closer about a week ago, so I think the brick wall might have been hit for Aldrich. I don't expect too much money to come in on Aldrich at -150, so if people are playing this fight, then I can see them playing the underdog. So I think the lines close up a little bit. I think Aldrich will come into this fight roughly around a -135 favourite, with Casey at around +110. As for how the fight plays out though, like I've already mentioned, I think it's going to be a really close fight. You've got JJ Aldrich that's absolutely the better striker in this fight, especially in that boxing range, but Cortney Casey's got some abilities outside at kicking range as well. She's tall, she fights quite long, and she's also got a potential grappling advantage in this fight. So how I see it playing out, I think Aldrich is definitely going to try and get into boxing range. She's got to close that distance, unload shots to the body and the head inside of that boxing range, good, clean, crisp punching, and that's where her skill set is. Whereas from Casey's perspective, I think she's going to want to keep this fight on the outside. She's got to try and prevent Aldrich closing the distance, kick at range, keep moving, stay out of the way of that boxing range, and if things do get a little bit too close for her, then close the distance all the way, clinch up, try and get Aldrich down to the mat and work the grappling. The thing is with Aldrich, I'd be surprised if she shot takedowns in this fight. She does tend to prefer to stay on the feet and strike, and with Casey being able to fight at range, being all the way out, and she might have an advantage inside the clinch as well, with her being tall and with Aldrich potentially not wanting to close that distance to risk getting taken down. I think that Casey could potentially trip Aldrich down and work on the mat as well. The fight's going to be really close. It wouldn't shock me if this fight went to a split decision, which, as I always say, a split decision, you want to be on the side of the plus money underdog, and that's the side I'm taking here. I think Casey could fight at range on the outside, and if Aldrich closes the distance, she could then just close the distance that little bit further, come all the way in and potentially trip Aldrich down to the mat and score some points grappling, maybe waste a little bit of time on the clock as well to look better in the judges' eyes. So for that reason, as I've said, I am going to side with the underdog, and I'm picking Cortney Casey to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Yahya versus Ray Rodriguez. Yahya is currently the -290 favourite. The comeback on Rodriguez at +245 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, I do understand why Yahya is a -290 favourite, but the fact that Ray Rodriguez could blast him out of the water does make me think that there's not too much value in that money line. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, I don't think it's going to move too much, if I'm being honest. I could see some money coming back in on Yahya, pushing him over -300, but then I do see some money coming in on the underdog, because I think people will look at Yahya as quite a slow, aging fighter, whereas Rodriguez is exciting and explosive. So I do think there's an argument of money coming in on either side. Ultimately, when they step into the cage on Saturday night, I don't think the line is going to be too far off from where it's sitting right about now. And as for how this fight plays out, when you break it down, it's relatively simple. Yahya is definitely going to try and get Ray Rodriguez down to the mat. If he gets him down to the mat, he's going to have his way with him. He's going to be able to grapple topside. If he gets him down within the first 10 seconds of a round, I think he'd be able to finish that round on top or submit him along the way. I think with Ray Rodriguez, because of his style, he's a kick-heavy striker, and when he throws his kicks, he can be taken down. We've seen it in tape. So I think if he's kicking heavily at Yahya, that's just going to aid Yahya's game as well, especially if those kicks are to the legs or to the body. He's got to fire the head kicks at Yahya, otherwise he is going to run the risk of getting taken down. And like I say, if he gets taken down and Yahya gets on top, then in theory it should be a wrap. But if Yahya can't score takedowns in this fight, I think that Rodriguez is going to be an absolute nightmare for him. Rodriguez is the younger fighter. He's got better movement. He's faster. He's more explosive. He's got more power. And sure, Yahya, in my opinion, does have an underrated striking game. He's got a Muay Thai background, but I just don't think that he matches up well with Rodriguez if this fight was to be won and lost on the feet. So that's my worry from a betting line perspective, because if Yahya, something happens, he gasses out or he picks up an injury, or maybe even Rodriguez's takedown defense is just on point on the night, then Rodriguez is going to give Yahya problems, and he is probably going to knock Yahya out or just dominate for the entire fight. So it's only for that reason it gives me some pause on the betting line. However, I do think the two most probable outcomes in this fight is Yahya getting takedowns every single round, spending enough time on top, causing Rodriguez problems, stopping him from being able to get up or taking him back down if he does, or Yahya gets takedowns and submits Rodriguez. Like I said, for me, those are the two most probable outcomes in this fight, and it's for those reasons I'm picking Yahya to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Charles Jourdain versus Marcelo Rojo. Charles Jourdain is currently the -260 favourite to come back on Rojo at +220 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, I really do think the line is too wide here. I don't think Jourdain should be a -260 favourite. I think the line should be much closer. I absolutely understand why he's the favourite, and I don't see a scenario where Jourdain would be an underdog here to Rojo, but -260 does feel a little bit too wide. So for me, the value side is Marcelo Rojo. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, I do think more money comes in on Jourdain, and I just don't agree with it because he was a -300 favourite in his last fight against Josh Culibao, who he should have beaten, on paper, and it was a close fight that ended in a draw. So although I do disagree with the money coming in on Charles Jourdain, I do think he's going to be popular. I do think he's going to be in a lot of people's parlays, and as I keep mentioning, those parlay entries do widen betting lines, so I can see Charles Jourdain entering the cage again at -300 come fight night on Saturday night. And as for how this fight plays out, I think it's going to be a relatively close fight. I think both fighters are going to come in here aggressive. I think that both fighters are going to really sit down on the punches, really look to get off on the volume early, really put combinations together, and really look to slam hard kicks to the legs, the body, and the head of each other as well. So it's going to be a fun fight. I do think that it's going to be the nature of the fight that makes this quite close, but I do have to give Jourdain the edge. Like I said, he is the rightful favourite in this fight. He just shouldn't be this big of a favourite. I think Jourdain, with the UFC experience, that will definitely help him here, help him to not lose his head in a firefight, which we could potentially even see some really crazy moments in this fight from that perspective. And it's in those moments where I think that he's going to have another advantage, and that's in the wrestling and the topside grappling, because if things get a bit too hot, get a bit too heavy for Jourdain inside the cage, I do think that he could potentially level change, take Marcelo Rojo down, and I think he's going to be able to have a lot of success topside, establish a top position against Rojo, and be able to close a round out that way. That's if he needs to. So the fact that I think that Jourdain probably does have an edge on the feet in regards to the technique and the diversity of his attacks as well, and then coupling that with a wrestling and grappling advantage also, I just think that Jourdain is the more well-rounded fighter. He's got more ways to win this fight, and he's going to be more comfortable in different aspects of this fight. So if it hits the mat, he's going to be more comfortable than Rojo, and if it's on the feet, then experience, technique and diversity should help him win there as well. For those reasons, I'm picking Charles Jourdain to win this fight. In the next fight, we've got Jonathan Martinez versus Davey Grant. Martinez is currently the -325 favourite to come back on Grant at +265 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, I think even at -325 the value sits with Jonathan Martinez, if I'm being honest. There's probably not too much value in playing him straight, but he certainly could be a parlay piece here. Now, as for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, I could see Martinez edging closer to that -400 range. I think at -400 it's starting to get a little bit too stretched in regards to value, so if that happens, I'm not saying the value flips over to Davey Grant, but I do think that Martinez will lose a lot of his value at -400. I think that's the way the betting line goes. I think people will be playing Martinez straight and in parlays as well, and that will rapidly widen this betting line. So I think Martinez is going to close around -400 when he steps in the cage on Saturday night. And as for how this fight plays out, I think it's a really, really tough fight for Davey Grant. I think Grant's pretty much a disadvantage everywhere. I think Martinez is the better striker, better technique, cleaner, crisper, more accurate. I think he's got more power in his strikes as well. I think he's faster. He's got cardio for days. And then when you look at the wrestling, I think both offensively and defensively, Martinez is the better wrestler. And then when you look at the grappling of both fighters, again, I think Martinez is just the better grappler, whether he's on top or whether he's on bottom. I think if Davey Grant manages to take him down, I think Martinez will be fine off his back. I think he'll be able to attack with submission attempts. Then I think he'll be able to stand back up if he fails there. And if he gets on top of Grant, then again, I just think he's better topside, better establishing a top position, more calm. He's comfortable on top as well. So I just think it's a really difficult fight for Davey Grant. And I hate to break fights down in this way, but I just don't see an obvious path to victory for Davey Grant apart from landing that one punch that changes everything, which could absolutely happen. As I say time and time again, these fighters are wearing 4-ounce gloves. The punches hit hard no matter who you are. So for me, that's the path to victory for Davey Grant. But outside of that, Martinez just appears to be the better fighter here. He's the fighter that's more likely to find a finish. He's the fighter that's more likely to win a decision. And I do think he's going to dominate from bell to bell here. So I'm picking Jonathan Martinez to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Jinh Frey versus the newcomer Gloria de Paula. And it's the newcomer de Paula that is the -185 favourite. The comeback on Frey at +160 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, even with the wide line for the UFC debutant in de Paula, I do think that -185 still holds some value. If this jumps to -210, -225, then the value will diminish a little bit. And at -225, the value would probably flip over to Frey in that scenario. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, the current trend is the money on de Paula. I do think that continues, but when it hits -200, there might be some bets coming in on Frey just out of principle and the fact that they might think this fight is close, and it's in those fights where you want the 2-1 underdog. So ultimately, I think there's going to be a little bit of fluctuation, not too much, and I think that both fighters are going to step into the cage on Saturday night roughly where they're sitting right about now in regards to those odds. But as for how this fight plays out though, Frey is a very well-rounded fighter. She's also very experienced. I don't think she excels in any one area of MMA, but she can strike well, she can wrestle well, she can grapple well. So she's well-rounded and that is going to help her in this fight. The thing is though, with de Paula, she's got a really solid and a really dangerous Muay Thai base with sharp punches coming down the middle. Those punches are like a sniper. And I just really like her style. She's dangerous on the feet. She's aggressive. She's calm as well. She doesn't really let anything faze her. So as she's coming forward and being aggressive, she's landing on her opponents. If her opponents try to close the distance into a clinch, then she'll happily clinch up with her opponents. She'll land nasty knees. She'll land elbows. She'll really look to do damage. And then in regards to the wrestling and the grappling, she looks like she checks out here as well. She can be taken down, but she doesn't allow the takedowns to come that easy on her, and she can get back up to her feet. If she gets in top position, then she looks relatively comfortable here as well. I really like what I see from Gloria de Paula. Obviously there's a big difference between the UFC debut and the Dana White Contender Series, which always does give me a little bit of a pause, but in all honesty, like I said, she looks like she checks out everywhere, and I think this is going to be a very difficult fight for Frey, because Frey is the type of fighter that likes to get into range, to land combinations. I think getting into range with de Paula is going to be difficult, closing that range without getting hit, and then if you do manage to close the range, you've got to avoid getting clinched up with de Paula and elbowed and kneed in the face. So I think it's going to be difficult for Frey, and obviously she's got to close the distance to score takedowns if she's going to take de Paula down as well. So I think stylistically it's a really good fight for de Paula. I'm really excited to see what version we see of her inside the cage. I do think that she's got a lot of upside in this fight, and for that reason I'm picking Gloria de Paula to win the fight. And in the final breakdown of this episode, we've got Jason Witt versus Matheus Semelsberger. It's Semelsberger that's actually the -125 favourite, with the comeback on Witt at +105 as the underdog. As for where the value is on this betting line, I think the value sits with the underdog in Jason Witt. I actually think he should be a slight favourite in this spot, so pretty much a line flip, but it is flipped the other way, so for me, the value is on the underdog. As for where the betting lines move throughout fight week, the current trend is the money coming in on Witt. He was +130, +135 just a few days ago, so a lot of money's come back in on him, and I agree with that line movement. I think that continues to happen, and I do think that both fighters will step into the cage on Saturday night roughly around a -110 pick'em on either side. As for how the fight plays out, I think it's going to be a wild fight. I think that's mainly because of Matheus Semelsberger though. He's got this wild nature about him where he'll come forward aggressively, a little bit recklessly. He'll throw a lot of wild shots. He'll look to take his opponents down as well. He does really mix things up well inside the cage. But Jason Witt, I actually think is much calmer than Semelsberger inside the cage. I think his fundamentals are better than the fundamentals of Semelsberger as well. And I think that the way he mixes everything up inside the cage is much cleaner than the way Semelsberger mixes things up, which should be really important in this fight. I think that when Semelsberger is going to come in recklessly and aggressively, I think Witt's just going to stick to his fundamentals, stick a jab out there, look for a 1-2, really halt that forward momentum from Semelsberger. And then when the time's right, Witt will start to land hard punches himself. He does pack a little bit of power, and then once he starts pushing Semelsberger backwards, that's when he'll start mixing in his wrestling, shooting for takedowns. And I don't know if Semelsberger's cardio will check out for 3 rounds with the way he starts his fights, and with the way I feel that this momentum is going to change within the fight as well. I do think that could potentially drain the cardio of Semelsberger. I think the longer this fight goes on, the easier it's going to become for Jason Witt. I don't think that Witt's going to have an easy time of it, especially in the first half around, the first few minutes of this fight. But I think once we get past that point, we will see Witt just slowly start to get his game together, slowly start to land on Semelsberger and impose his own game plan. I think Witt is the value side as an underdog here. I think he is the slightly better fighter in this fight, and the fighter that will just mix things up better. And for those reasons, I'm picking Jason Witt to win this fight. And that's all for this episode of On the Moneyline. I hope you all enjoyed it, and once again guys, I'd appreciate all the likes to the video and subscriptions to our MMAPlay365 YouTube channel too. Remember, you can get all the betting advice you'll ever need over at MMAPlay365.com. We cater for long-term gamblers that like to build their own bets and strategies, gamblers that just want to follow exactly what I bet on, and we also cater for you fun gamblers that like the long shot fun parlays or ACCAs, accumulators as we call them in the UK. Even if you only want our best value underdog for the event, which is always free by the way, we have plenty of different packages and subscription options for you guys to choose from, and they're all at very affordable prices too. Just hop on to MMAPlay365.com and see what's best for you. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you at the next event.